Hey everyone, it's Dr. Hardin, and I just wanted to go over the rest of Chapter 8, the muscular system, with you, since I can't be there today due to travel. So I'll be posting this shortly to YouTube, and I'll post a link. And hopefully you found it by the fact that you're listening to me right now. So let's start out. The first thing I want to go over is a couple other muscle types that we learned about when we did tissues. And this one is smooth muscle. And these fibers are elongated and they have like tapered ends. They don't really have striations like we see in skeletal muscle. And I'll show you that picture shortly. But and they really don't have sarcoplasmic reticulum, which stores the calcium. So they have a little bit of a different way of contracting. But they do have actin and myosin, and they do extend the length of the cell, but they don't look like skeletal or cardiac muscle. That's why there's no striations. So let's take a look at this picture here, and let me get my pointer going so that you can see. I've got my pen. So here's smooth muscle, and as you can see, I'm going to circle it. There we go. You can see this wide belly and this smooth taper. That's one smooth muscle cell. And so if you look at it over here, you can see that one smooth muscle cell there. Okay, and then there's the nuclei in every single smooth muscle cell. And that's different than skeletal muscle because skeletal muscle has multiple nuclei per cell. So there's different types of smooth muscle. One of the types of smooth muscle is called multi-unit. And so the fibers, the muscle cells themselves occur separately. Instead of like what we saw on the previous slide where they're sheets, they're separate. And so those are the ones that are located in our blood vessels and in the iris of the eye, so that they can constrict the pupil or constrict the blood vessel. And then we have visceral smooth muscle, which is more of the picture that was shown on the slide previous. And they occur in different sheets of muscle. And they can stimulate one another. And the cool thing about that is they display what's called rhythmicity. And rhythmicity is that they can all work together and contract together. And so this is what it does when there's peristalsis in any hollow tube or organ. And an example of that would be contractions like in a gallbladder, which holds bile, or contractions of the small intestine to move food, or even your esophagus to move food into the stomach. All right, next slide. So the contraction, how it works is the myosin binding to actin mechanism is similar for the smooth muscle and the skeletal muscle. So that part's the same, right? But instead of the impulse generator chemical, in skeletal muscle it's acetylcholine always, but in smooth muscle it can be either acetylcholine or a chemical known as norepinephrine. And some of you may know it as noradrenaline. And it can stimulate or inhibit. Well, in skeletal muscle, acetylcholine always stimulates. So smooth muscle is much slower to contract than skeletal muscle, so it's slow to contract, slow to relax. But the thing is it can contract much longer, and it doesn't need more ATP in order to do so. It can use the same amount of skeletal muscle, but stay contracted. Now, cardiac muscle is pretty similar to skeletal muscle, except that it branches, but it's striated like skeletal muscle. And those branches, though, allow for three-dimensional networks. And the mechanism of contraction is really almost exactly the same as skeletal and smooth with the actin and myosin. However, there is one huge difference is cardiac muscle has those T tubules, but the T-tubules in cardiac muscles supply extra calcium. And that extra calcium allows cardiac muscles to contract for a little bit of a longer period. And that allows for the heartbeat to take place. Also, cardiac muscle, different from skeletal muscle, is self-exciting. And like smooth muscle is rhythmic. So this is what creates that pattern of contraction of cardiac muscle, and then relaxation, contraction, relaxation, and so on. Now, cardiac muscle does have a unique structure called intercalated discs, and these are complex membrane junction, and they join the cardiac muscle cells. And what these discs allow is for transmission of the force of contraction from one cell to the next, basically allowing the cells to talk to each other. And this aids in having a rapid transmission of the impulses, the electrical impulses throughout the heart, because you want the cardiac muscle cells to contract together. Imagine if they contract all at different times. That's called ventricular fibrillation, and that's not compatible with life. Here's a picture of cardiac muscle, and you can see that it's similar to skeletal muscle with the long strips, except this particular picture shows branching. You can see the branches on this particular picture. And then you can see the intercalated discs right where it's showing you, and it's almost like a line there. And then, of course, the nuclei. All right, let's go back to skeletal muscle, because we need to talk about muscles themselves, how they work as a whole. So skeletal muscles have an origin and an insertion. So we're talking about the entire muscle at this point. So the end that doesn't move is called the origin. And then the end that actually moves, so if you contract your biceps and you move your forearm and your ulna and your radius right towards the humerus, right, that's called the insertion point. So it pulls that insertion towards the origin. Now, some muscles have more than one insertion, and some have more than one origin. So it can do that way. It can make various different contractions and allow for various movements. So here's a great picture, an example of origin and insertion of the biceps. So the biceps origin is up here. So there's the two origins. Sorry, my circle's a little lame, but you get the point. And then the insertion here is located on the radial bone. Okay, and then we have insertions of other muscles on the ulna, which is on this side, which is here, and then the radius. So you contract your bicep, you pull that radius bone towards the origin. Okay, so the contraction causes that movement to occur. Now, when skeletal muscles work together, they will interact with each other, and there's some terms that you should know. Of a group of muscles, the one that really does the work, right, it's the agonist. So in the example previous, that would be the biceps, or the bicep muscle. And we also call that the prime mover. Now, that muscle might need some help with some other muscles, and so in those helper muscles are called synergists. Now, an opposing muscle, often what it does is stabilizes the moving muscle, the prime mover. And so in this case, again, referring to the bicep, the antagonist muscle would be the tricep. So this relationship can be different depending on the role of contraction that these muscles are playing. So if the tricep is the prime mover, then the bicep muscle becomes the antagonist. So they change roles. All right, so it's important to kind of give you an idea of how muscles are named. And a lot of times there is no rhyme or reason, I'll be honest with you. But sometimes you can tell what the muscle does based on the name, or you can tell the shape of the muscle so you can identify it based on the name. So there's all sorts of size, shape, location, action, etc. That is involved in how we name muscles. So here's some examples. We have the pectoralis major. That's named after the pectoralis is the pectoral region, which is the upper chest, and that's based on location, and it's the major. That means it's the large one, so it's size and location. Now the deltoid, that's your shoulder muscle, and the deltoid looks like a delta, a Greek delta, and so that's simply named after its shape. Then you have the action. So in this case, we have the extensor digitorum. So it extends the digits. So to tell you a little bit more, right, it basically extends your fingers, right? The digits are fingers. All right, the biceps brachii is named for the number of attachments. That's 2. You saw that in the picture, as well as its location, and it's in the brachial region, so it's the brachii. And here we have one that's named after just attachments, and you can see the attachments right in the name. The sternum, clito, that's the clavicle, and the mastoid. And the mastoid is the mastoid process of the skull. So that's named after its attachments. And then this one is the direction of the fibers as well as the location. This is one of your abdominal muscles, and this is the external oblique. It's the most superficial of all of the muscles. And the external, therefore, it's on top, right? It's external. And the direction of the fibers, or the direction is that they are oblique, which means that they're diagonal. Like, okay, forgive me on that, but you get the point. All right, here's all the muscles. Probably more muscles that are on your muscle list for lab. For lecture, it's important that you have a good idea of these muscles. Okay, back to slide number 14 or whatever slide number it is. Probably slide something, but anyway, back to the whole muscle. This is the trapezius muscle that I was referring to, and here's a portion of the sternocleidomastoid there, but this big muscle right here, right, and on this side, that's your trapezius muscle. So let's return back to our where we were on those slides. All right, we're going to go through some of these main muscles that you should know. So let's start with the muscles of facial expression. And these are the muscles that allow you to smile, to frown, to do anything with your human face. Roll your eyes at me, my stupid jokes. So there's several muscles that are involved in that. None of them are that we're really going to be concentrating on, but it's important that you know that they're there. There's also muscles of mastication, and this is chewing. Mastication means chewing, and there's muscles that allow for up and down, side to side, chewing, and these muscles are always attached to the skull, and as well as the lower jaw. And one of the chewing muscles that's important is called the masseter. And so let's look at this masseter. It's this pretty big muscle here. I guess I should change my pen color. Let's do black. All right, there's your masseter. And it's attached to the mandible, as well as this is called the zygomatic arch and the temporal bone. All right, muscles that move the head. So there's a lot of paired muscles in the neck and the back that flex, extend, and turn the head. The major muscle that does this that we're going to discuss is the sternocleidomastoid. Remember we talked about that, the three attachment points being the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process of the temporal bone of the skull. Also, muscles that move the pectoral girdle. These are muscles that move the scapula, the bone, the scapula. And these major muscles include the trapezius. And I'm going to show you a picture of everything shortly. So at least here is the sternocleidomastoid. This is just a portion of it. I'll show you a little bit more detail in a minute. But here's the insertion on the mastoid process of the temporal bone of the skull. All right, muscles that move the arm. So there's several muscles that move the arm, and they do different actions. One flexes the arm, and remember the arm is where the humerus is located. So the flexor flexes the muscle, and that includes the pectoralis major. When extending the humerus, that muscle is called the latissimus dorsi. And abducting, which means moving away from the body, you abduct from the midline, is the deltoid. Okay, and then there's several rotators as well, but we're not including those on our list of muscles to learn. All right, there we go. We have the trapezius. Okay, it inserts up here on the occipital bone of the skull, or one of the attachments is the occipital bone. It also attaches to the spinous process of the vertebrae. And we also have the latissimus dorsi. Okay, that inserts on the humerus. So you can see why it has action on the humerus. Same as the trapezius. And then the deltoid, that shoulder muscle that I was referring to. And I was talking about it as well when we were talking about the shape of the muscle. You can see that it kind of resembles kind of a triangle, which is a delta in the Greek alphabet. Okay, looking at the anterior view, there's that pectoralis major. Okay, so you can tell the difference. This is the pec minor over here, pec major. Here's another portion of the deltoid. Here's more of the sternocleidomastoid. This is the other part, right? You can see here insertion on the sternum. Here, insertion on the clavicle. Okay. And you can see a little bit of the trapezius on this picture as well. Okay, this is some familiar muscles because I was using them as examples, but muscles that move the forearm, right? And this is where your ulna and your radius are. And these muscles arise from the humerus and then insert on or connect to the ulna and the radius. So we have flexors. Our main flexor is the biceps brachii, and the extensor is the triceps brachii as well. Just like I talked about earlier. So biceps flex, right? Triceps extend. We also have rotators, but again, there's not ones that are on our muscle list. We're not going to worry about that. Just know that rotators are part of the muscles that move the forearm. So here we have the biceps. There's the deltoid again. And here's the triceps. Okay, sorry, I had to use another picture. Your book doesn't have a nice picture for me to use. So this is from a model, one of the models that you have. So the triceps being in the back there. Okay, muscles that move the head. Muscles that move the hand. These are very, there's a lot of them, and they're very hard to identify. Now, those of you moving on to anatomy after this course will definitely learn the flexors and extensors. And should you wish, I'd be happy to give you a list that I give my anatomy students so that you can start learning that. The flexors are all muscles on the anterior side of the arm, the forearm, and the extensors are all on the posterior side. And remember, this is an anatomical position. So make sure you remember that. flexors anterior, extensors posterior. So here's the few. We have the extensor carpi radialis longus. We have the extensor carpi radialis brevis, the extensor digitorum, the extensor carpi ulnaris, and then on this side, it throws you for a loop because look, we have a flexor. But it's right on the side, and note that it inserts on the anterior portion, so it really isn't part of the posterior group, but we'll let it be. Note though that all of these are extensors. Extensor. Okay, now looking at the anterior, right? Notice the flexor. Now, there's not as many flexor names as there are extensor names, but it doesn't mean some of these don't flex. So one of the flexors that we haven't talked about is the brachioradialis, as well as the palmaris longus. Now, pronation and supination are named after the supinator, the pronator teres, and the pronator quadratus. Those three all work together to either pronate the arm or supinate the arm. Or the forearm, excuse me. We do have one extensor on this side, the extensor carpi radialis longus. But note that it's on the side, so again, we let it pass. All right, here's some muscles that are, to me, pretty interesting. You can look at these on the torso models. This group of muscles basically connects the rib cage and the vertebral column to the pelvic girdle. And there's a band of connective tissue. It's really tough connective tissue. It's called the linea alba. And you can see this on those models. It extends from the xiphoid process all the way to the symphysis pubis, or the pubic symphysis. And this serves as an attachment for certain abdominal muscles. So it's an important structure to know. Hint, hint. All right. The muscles we're going to talk about in the abdominal wall, though, are the external oblique and the rectus abdominis. So, the rectus abdominis, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they're on both sides. So technically, you could have a 10-pack. Most people call it a 6-pack because it's these three muscles, right, that people work to create a 6-pack. So, but technically you have a 10-pack. So this is the rectus abdominis. Notice that it's in the middle area. It's deep to the external and internal oblique muscles. But it's important because it's located right next to that linea alba, right? And the linea alba, as I stated before, is simply a band of connective tissue, and the rectus femoris is associated with it. Now, we also have the external oblique, and you'll find that again on the muscle that is the muscles on the torso models. And I'm actually going to do my best to write here. Note that the external oblique, it attaches to this broad piece of connective tissue. That's called an aponeurosis. And I'm using my finger, so bear with me. Aponeurosis. Okay, and it's just some dense connective tissue that meets in the middle at the linea alba, which is the band. Okay, and that's how the external oblique inserts into connective tissue, not on a bone, which is a little unusual. Okay, muscles that move the thigh. So we have the anterior group muscles, one of them including the psoas major. And a little story about the psoas major. It is considered the same muscle that on a cow we would consider filet mignon. So just an interesting fact. The posterior group muscles that move the thigh are the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius. There is a gluteus minimus, but we're not going to include that in our posterior group muscles. And then we have the adductors. These muscles, remember, add the part back to the body, and that would include the gracilis. So let's take a look at those. So here we have the psoas major, the filet mignon. Right, there's the psoas major. This muscle here looks kind of like a blade of grass, hence its name, gracilis, and the psoas major. And then looking posteriorly, we have the gluteus maximus, right? That's what you sit on. And then you have the gluteus medius, which is right underneath the gluteus maximum or maximus and is inserting onto the pelvic or hip bone. Another picture of the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius. All right, what about muscles that move the leg? And this would be the tibia and fibula. And because we call it the upper portion of the leg, the thigh, and then the actual leg is where the tibia and fibula are. So we have flexors, and these include the hamstring muscles. These are three muscles that you need to know about. They're the biceps femoris, the semitendinosus, and the semimembranosus. There's also a muscle called the sartorius that helps to move the leg. The extensors include the quads, or we can call them the quadriceps femoris group. And there's four muscles involved with the quadriceps. That's the rectus femoris, the vastus lateralis, the vastus medialis, and the vastus intermedius. So the nice thing is if you know vastus, you just need to remember lateralis, medialis, intermedius. Okay, so we're looking at, from this angle, the quadriceps. There's the sartorius. Note that the sartorius is really easy to identify. It goes diagonally across the thigh. The rectus femoris is the very large muscle that you'll notice of the thigh, and it's on the most superficial. Then there's the three vastus muscles. You can't see the vastus intermedius because it's directly under the rectus femoris. But what you can see is the vastus lateralis. It's on the lateral side. So it's there, and the vastus medialis on the medial side. Okay, again, the vastus intermedius is located under the rectus femoris muscle. All right. So here's another view of the vastus lateralis. And you know, they're named because they're vast muscles. They're big. Right? Another view of the rectus femoris, another view of the sartorius, and then a view of the biceps femoris. But let's look at the whole group of the hamstrings. So here we go. We have the hamstring muscles. So here we have the lateral muscle is the biceps femoris. So if you're just counting muscles over, that's the quickest way to identify the three hamstring muscles. So you have the biceps femoris. In the middle, the semitendinosus, and then medial, you have the semimembranosus. Okay, so again, biceps femoris, lateral, in the middle, semitendinosus, and medial, semimembranosus. All right, we have muscles that move the foot. These muscles are located attached to either the femur, fibula, or tibia, but they move the foot up, down, or turn turn it, all sorts of things. So we have dorsal flexors. That's when you have, you put your legs out and you flatten your feet, put your toes towards your head. That's the tibialis anterior. The plantar flexors are the ones that point your toe, and that would be one of the significant ones is the gastrocnemius. And the gastrocnemius, the tendon, is a tendon you should be familiar with. It's called the Achilles tendon, and it inserts on the calcaneus, or the heel bone. So it's also called the calcaneal tendon, and that's the same as the Achilles tendon. There's muscles that invert the foot, and that would be to put the sole medially. We're not going to talk about any of those muscles, but we will talk about one everter, and this everts so that the sole of the foot is facing laterally. And this is the fibularis or peroneus. Peroneus is an old name for the fibula. So let's just go with fibularis longus. So here's the tibialis anterior. You can't miss it. You find the tibia, and lateral to it is the tibialis anterior. You can also look over to this side, to the lateral side. That's where you're going to find the fibularis longus. And you can see a little bit of the gastrocnemius. Let's have a better picture of that. There's more of the gastroc. Here you can see the nice full view, the lateral view of that fibularis longus. Here's that calcaneal tendon, right? The Achilles tendon that inserts on the calcaneus, or the heel bone. All right, there we have it in all its glory. The gastrocnemius, I call it the gastroc. There's two heads, the medial and the lateral. There's the calcaneal tendon, the Achilles tendon, going all the way down, inserting on the calcaneus.